In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding the useEffect hook within React. We're first going to go over kind of an explanation of what the useEffect hook is. Then we'll dive into some examples to make that explanation a little bit more clear. And then at the end, I will give you just some kind of overall general tips when working with the useEffect hook. As you know, I know when I was first starting out with React, this useEffect hook was probably the most tricky one to kind of wrap my head around. So I think these general tips will also be helpful for you. So first things first, what is the useEffect hook? Well, this is a hook that React gives you to perform side effects or to perform effects. And a side effect is effectively whenever you have a component that needs to do a task that influences something outside of that component. So whenever you have some code that needs to influence kind of the outside world, outside of just the isolated component that you have. So some examples of this might be an API request. It could be setting up a subscription so you can better handle some different events. It could be manually manipulating the DOM, so taking the document title and changing that, or grabbing an element manually from the DOM and manipulating that in some way. All of these would be considered side effects because they all influence something outside of just the running of that single component that you're in. Now, these effects can be categorized into kind of two different categories. You'll have effects that require cleanup and effects that don't require cleanup. So an example of an effect that doesn't require cleanup would be something like an API request. Usually, you just make the API request, and then once that request has resolved, there's not really, you might handle that data in some way, but it's not like you have to go back in time to making that request and clean something up. Like it kind of automatically cleans itself up. It doesn't keep making that API request over and over and over again. So that would be something that you don't necessarily need to clean up, even though it is a side effect. However, if you added something like a set interval and you set an interval to run some code over and over again, well, it's likely that you'll want to clean that code up so it doesn't continuously keep running throughout the duration of your entire application. So that might be an effect in which you do want to clean up. And luckily in the useEffect hook, we do have ways to kind of clean up these effects that we have. So let's kind of dive in a little bit more on how the useEffect hook works and some examples of working with it. So the useEffect hook, it is a function that you get from React. And then once you import it, you can use this useEffect hook. Now here, I'm using the useEffect hook by just accessing the useEffect method on the React object. So I'm importing React from React, and then I'm accessing the useEffect hook. You don't need to necessarily do this. You can just do useEffect here, and you can import useEffect from React. All right, but sometimes I think this makes it a little bit more clear just to kind of say, hey, we are using useEffect from React here, but it's totally standard to just import useEffect in isolation and not access it on the React object that you import from React. All right. But this useEffect hook is going to be a function, and it's going to take two arguments. The first argument that you pass to useEffect is a function. So as you can see in this example here, I am passing useEffect an anonymous inline arrow function. And this is fairly standard to do, just to pass a useEffect, a function anonymously right in as the first argument. So here I'm calling useEffect, and then I'm creating this inline function and passing it directly into useEffect here as my first argument. All right, so the first argument the useEffect takes is a function. And by default, the useEffect hook will call this function after every render of the component that it's within. So every time this app component renders, currently this useEffect hook here is going to run the function that I pass in. So it's going to run this window.alert every time this app renders. So you're going to see every time I open up my browser here, I get this alert, Code Ryan. And if I click OK and I refresh it, I'm going to get this alert again because my component is going to remount. So it's going to run my inner function and it's going to give me this alert again. All right. So By default, the useEffect hook will run the function you pass in on every render of your component. Now, you have to be careful with this because say I set some state within this function that I pass into useEffect. Well, every time your state changes within a component, it's going to re-render that component. So if I change some state that I had in my application, it's going to trigger a re-render. And if this function runs on every re-render, well, it's going to re-render again, and it's going to change that state. And then since state changed, it's going to re-render. And then you're in this infinite loop of setting state, re-rendering, running your function, setting state, re-rendering, and that can cause infinite loops. So sometimes you do want to set some state within the function that you pass into useEffect, but you don't want it to trigger on every re-render. And I would say in most instances, you don't want this default behavior of the useEffect hook running on every re-render. So to avoid this, you can pass a second argument to the useEffect function. And this second argument is going to be an array of dependencies. And all that means is that you're going to pass an array of values to this useEffect method here. And anytime those values change, that is going to trigger your first argument that you pass to the useEffect, your function, that will trigger the running of that function. So I can pass it a second array here, just like so. And every time that a value within my array changes, that is going to trigger the rerunning of this first argument here, my function that I passed to useEffect. So if I had some different state in here, I could pass in my state, and then maybe I have another value in here that is, some number, and then I can pass in these values to this useEffect hook, and that basically says, hey, only run the function that I pass into useEffect whenever one of these values change. Now, sometimes there's not really an appropriate value for you to pass in to run this inner useEffect hook, but you still only want your function to run maybe when this component mounts. So the initial mounting of this component, the first time it's rendered. Well, for useEffect, if you only want your passed in function here to run when this component mounts here, so when this app component mounts, let's say I only want it to run once when it first mounts. Well, to do that, you pass an empty dependency array. So if I pass this empty dependency array here, that's telling useEffect here, hey, only run my passed in function here. So this passed in inline function, only run that function when my app component first mounts to my page. All right, so pass an empty array as your array of dependencies if you only want to run something on mount, but you pass in values to this dependency array if you want your inner function to run every time a certain value changes. Now, we'll talk about kind of one key thing to remember here when I get into my general tips later, but those are the fundamentals of how the useEffect method works within React. You pass in two arguments. The first argument is a function that you want to run, and the second argument basically tells useEffect when you want to run that function. If you don't pass any second argument here, then it's going to run on every single re-render of the component it's within. If you pass an empty array here, it's going to run only when this component first mounts to your page, when it's first rendered to the page. But you can also pass in an array of values here. So I could have several values within my array, and that's telling useEffect, hey, only run my passed in function here. It will first run it on mount, and then it will run this function every time one of those values within my dependency array changes. Now, the useEffect hook has one additional feature that I definitely need to discuss here for you to gain a full understanding of how it works. And this extra feature here is being able to do that cleanup we talked about earlier. So how do we handle the case when we have an effect and that effect needs us to clean up after it? Well, in the useEffect method here, within our passed in function, we can actually return a function, and that function that we return, it's going to be called when our overall component unmounts from the page, and that function is going to be called before the next time your passed in function is ran. Sounds a little bit confusing. Let me kind of explain via this example here. So I have a overall component called counter, and I define a useEffect hook right here, and then I pass in an inline function as my first argument. So my first argument to useEffect is my inline function. And within my inline function, you can see that I set an interval. And my interval is going to call this passed in prop here, this set count function, and it's going to increment this count by 1. But within my passed in function to useEffect here, I'm actually going to return an additional function. So here, this is me creating an inline function here, and it's actually going to be me clearing this interval with this ID. Now, there's potentially better ways to do this with refs, but this is just kind of for the sake of example, all right? And we'll go over useRef in future videos. But here, this function that I return from my passed in function here, this function right here is going to be called when my counter component unmounts, and it's going to be called before the next running of my inline function that I pass into useEffect. And then additionally, I only pass an empty array as my array of dependencies. So this is telling useEffect, hey, only run this passed in function on mount, on the first rendering of this component. Let's say I did have some value within this dependency array to trigger it to run my inline function multiple times. Well, then next time my inline function gets called, React will actually call my cleanup function here first, and then it would call my passed in inline function. So the way this would work is it would run this inline function on mount, and then before the next time this inline function is called, it's going to run my cleanup function again. And additionally, whenever this counter component gets unmounted from the page, it's going to call this cleanup function. All right, so you can return a function from your passed in function to useEffect, and that will act as a cleanup function, and it will be called before the next running of your passed in function and when this component is unmounted to the page. So if I show you this example here, I have an overall app component, and I create some state, which is just my count, and then here I'm going to render my counter, and I'm going to pass in my set count function, because it expects that as a prop right here. And it's going to increment the count on an interval here every second. And then once this component gets unmounted, I'm going to make sure to clear my interval to clean up here. And in my kind of main React code here, I have some logic that says, hey, if the count is less than 10, then I want to render my counter. But if it's not less than 10, then I do not want to render my counter. So what I would expect here is when my count is greater than 10, it's not going to render my counter. So that is effectively going to stop this incrementing of this count, because it's going to unmount my counter and it's going to clear my interval. So my count is no longer going to be incremented here. So we should see that my count is just going to remain at 10 here, because I'm no longer going to be incrementing my counter, because I make sure to clean up my interval here. So let's see this in action in my browser here. And let me refresh here just to make sure that my state is good. So first you're going to see, okay, my counter is incrementing up here because it's no longer less than 10. It's going to keep that interval going. But then it hits 10 here. And then my logic in my code, it's like, hey, since my count is no longer less than 10, I'm not going to render my counter. I'm going to clear my interval here, and I'm no longer going to increment my count. So my count here is just going to stay at 10. And as we can see, my count does just stay at 10. But what if I forget my cleanup function and I forget to clean this up here? Well, if I remove this here, you're going to see that, okay, even if my component unmounts here, I'm never going to clear this interval. So this set count function is going to keep running and keep running and keep running. So this is going to actually cause a bug in which my count doesn't stop incrementing. And if I refresh my page here and we see this start counting up, we first see it gets kind of a weird behavior because I'm not kind of incrementing it correctly and I'm not cleaning up after the running of my function. And then we also see that since I never clear this interval, it just is going to keep going and keep going and keep going because I don't remember to clean up within my useEffect function. So in your useEffects here, make sure that if you have an effect in which you need to clean up after, return a function from your passed in function, and that returned function, it will be ran whenever this component is unmounted from the page and before the next running of your passed in function. Now, for some general tips with useEffect, it's helpful to just do one task within each useEffect. So let's say you need to make an API request, and then you also need to, reset the document title to some string or something like that after that API request is made, and then you need to perform some effect after that. Well, it's probably best, and this is recommended through the React docs, to have your useEffect hooks do one thing and only one thing. So instead of just having one long useEffect hook to where we handle that API request and then we set the title of the document and then we adjust everything there, it would probably be better to have like 3 separate useEffect hooks that just do one thing on mount. Now, of course, if something needs to occur sequentially, one thing after another, it might make sense to do it within just a single useEffect hook. But in general, if you can keep your useEffect hooks kind of isolated to just doing one thing, it's probably going to make your code a bit less buggy and a bit more easy to reason about. Additionally, one tricky thing about the useEffect hook is that dependency array. So managing when your function runs based on the values that change within that dependency array. And you have to be especially careful if you have a value that is passed by reference within that dependency array. So a non-primitive value. So within this dependency array, let's say I had, some object within it or some array within it. These values are passed by reference and they are not passed by value. So they're non-primitive values within JavaScript. Well, every single time my counter component re-renders here, it's going to create a whole new object here. And since it creates a whole new object here, it's going to see it as a new value. So it's going to recall this useEffect. And then if this useEffect hook changes some state, well, it's going to re-render my counter. And then since my counter was re-rendered, well, this is now going to be a new object. And then we're stuck in that cycle again. So if you have a value in there that is a non-primitive value, it can trigger some issues because those values are going to be reinitialized every single time your counter re-renders here, and that can cause issues. And it works the same way if I had a function here within my dependency array. It would reinitialize that function on every re-render. The dependency array sees that as an entirely new value, and then it would trigger more re-renders, and it just can cause bugs. So be very careful in your dependency array when using values that are passed by reference, because often those are reinitialized on every re-render, and React will see those as completely new values and trigger your inner function to continuously keep running. So in general, I would try to avoid values that are non-primitive values within that dependency array. You'll want to use things like numbers, strings, booleans, those primitive values within that dependency array whenever you can, as that's going to lead to less of these bugs that, you actually end up reinitializing a object, and that causes a different kind of reference to that object every time a component re-renders, and that just can trigger some errors. And then in general, I think that the useEffect hook I've worked in a professional application using React for the last almost 3 years now. I would say the most common bugs that occur in our application, they tend to occur from just kind of mismanaging this useEffect hook and having incorrect values in the dependency array, forgetting to clean up, doing different things like that. So in general, if you have ways to structure your code in which you can use the useEffect hook a bit less overall, I think that that is generally a good idea. So, for example, let's say you need to set some state after something in your UI is clicked. And then let's also say after your state change, you want to change something else in your program. Well, it might be better to do all of that within your on-click handler rather than, like, a way that you could do it is you could write a useEffect hook and you put some of your state within your dependency array. And then let's say that state gets changed on your on-click, and then you want to run something else within your useEffect hook. You could technically do that by just passing that state within your dependency array, and the function that you pass into useEffect will be called anytime that state changes. Well, I think a better approach is just not writing the useEffect hook whatsoever and just handling those different functionality that you want to do when that state changes. Just handle that within your on-click handler. And then that can kind of help prevent a whole host of issues of using your useEffect hook a bunch throughout your application. And you're trying to use your useEffect hook like every time a piece of state changes, rather than like just trying to use your useEffect hook when you have to perform certain side effects within your app. All right. So in general, if you can avoid your useEffect hook, this doesn't mean that it's bad to use by any means. Like, it's a hook within React for a reason. However, just, consider that sometimes if you can handle some functionality outside of useEffect without writing a useEffect hook at all, that might be a better approach rather than having a bunch of different useEffects throughout your entire application. All right, so the useEffect hook within React is how you perform effects or side effects within React. And a side effect is whenever you need to perform some task within your application that affects the outside world. So let's say I have a component and I need to affect something in my outside world, something outside of that component. That would be an effect. This could be API requests. This could be manually manipulating the DOM, different things like that. Now your effects, you're going to have effects that require cleanup and effects that don't require cleanup. For the ones that require cleanup, you can do that within your useEffect hook. And the way that the useEffect hook works is the first argument you pass to useEffect is going to be a function, and you basically tell useEffect when to run that function. And the way that you do that is the second argument you pass to useEffect is an array of dependencies. And anytime a value within that array changes, it's going to re-render your passed in function. Now, if you only want to run something on mount, you can pass an empty array to your useEffect hook. And if you want to rerun your passed in function every re-render, you could just not pass a dependency array whatsoever. And then for your useEffect hook, if you need to perform cleanup, return a function from your overall passed in function that you pass as a first argument to useEffect. And this function will be ran when your overall component unmounts and before the next running of your passed in function. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot about useEffect within it. It's definitely an important hook to understand when writing professional React code. And I will see you in that next one.